All right, so today we've got Dan Shell joining us from Shell Bike. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about your history with mountain biking.
I started mountain biking really when I was like 10 or 12, and I was on like Huffies that my parents would buy me from Costco. And I remember my folks banning me from jumping it off curbs, this particular orange Huffy, and I promptly broke it, and then I eventually went into a bike shop and bought a proper bike. It was a Kona Cinder Cone, Marzocchi Z2 Air, I believe. Never actually held air. And I was trying to do the clipless pedal thing, and I did some racing. Went to school at Western Oregon and got connected into Black Rock Mountain Bike Association, and kind of got a job at Santiam Bikes through some trail work that I was doing with the manager of the trail I was working on at the time. That was Troy Munsell at Granny's Kitchen. And he offered me a job, and I went into Santiam Bikes in a busy April, and there wasn't really any training. It was just like, okay, now go work and help these people. And I'd done a lot of tinkering, not professionally on my own. And so I had some knowledge to go off of, but it was pretty much trial by fire. And I remember one of my friends that I was working with telling me that if I'm working on a BMX, just tighten every bolt as tight as I possibly can. And that didn't end well, obviously. So, I worked at Santiam for 9 years. Really always had a liking for suspension. I was taking apart suspension when I was 13 years old, trying to fix my silo. There's a little plastic clip that would blow off the damper inside, and so I remember gluing that down so it would hold in one piece and make it down a run. I just kind of always geared towards suspension, and I tried some other work too. I was a personal support worker for a little while and done a little bit of professional trail work too. But in the end, like, the skills that I learned at the bike shop, really, like, that's what I need to make my living. And so I ended up going out on my own after I went from Santiam Bicycle to the Hub, where I was teaching for a little while, and then to Peak Sports. So at that point, I had already been amassing tools on my own, and I just decided to start doing it on my own, and started with a few customers, built more, eventually got my business license and accounts with Fox and SRAM and QVP and all the suppliers that you really need to run a business in the bike world, a service business. And I'm just looking for the day where I can kind of hit a plateau of the tools I need to buy, because it's just never ending. And I know that it will never end because there's always new product being put out. But it's been a slow burn, and hoping to ramp that up soon.
How do we find Shell Bike?
Shellbike.com, or you can email me at dan@shellbike.com. I'm on Instagram at shellbiketech. Really, my Instagram is where I kind of showcase my work and feature some unique things that I'm doing.
Let's say, new mountain bikers, they're taking their new bike out for, 4 or 5 rides, had a lot of fun. What are some things that they should look at after they've taken it for a few rides?
Well, the first thing I would do is just really get in tune with your bike from the first ride, especially if it's new. Try to note what it feels like to not have any bearings loose, not have anything rattling or jingling or knocking or making any weird noises, and just kind of try to really remember that. Like, you could even go so far as to get a GoPro run set up so that you can actually hear the bike on the trail. And then after you break it in, I would just listen for rattles and knocks, feel for knocks. One good way to tell if, for example, if your headset loosens up, pull the bike up on the back wheel and bounce it, and you will for sure feel a loose headset by bouncing it. It's not so much of an issue anymore, but wheel tension used to be a real thing. You'd take a bike out new and you really had to keep an eye on the wheels and what the tension is. So I would definitely, like, from day one, squeeze the spokes, find a pair that are all kind of parallel, and squeeze them, and then give each one a pluck, like you're plucking a guitar string, and just note, like, mentally what that tone sounds like. I mean, it doesn't have to be exact, obviously, but you want to be able to go back, a month or 2 months down the line and pluck it and notice if there's a drastic reduction in tension. Cable stretch, there's not actually, it's not a cable stretching, it's the housing compressing. But when a bike is built, if the cables aren't seated into place properly, they can come loose a little bit, and that's why there's a barrel adjuster on your shifter. Those kind of things are basic. And then presuming that everything was tuned right from the shop, I would just put a chain checker on it every once in a while, keep it clean. A clean bike is a happy bike, that's for sure. Keep the chain nice and clean with a little bit of lubricant on it. The cleanliness of your chain has a lot to do with how it wears. More to do, actually, than how it's used. So just always try to keep it clean and shiny. And
one of the inspirations I had for this particular segment was I worked at a bike shop a long time ago, and we had sold a customer a bike, and it was their kid's bike, and the kid had ridden it for 6 months or so. And he brought it in. He's like, "Oh, this thing's all falling apart. All these pieces are falling off of it." And one of the things that had happened was the headset had come loose, and there was no way to retighten it because the head tube had ovalized. And I realized that there was a handful of things that if you don't spot those on a bike as the bike's breaking in, you can cause irreparable damage to it.
Sure, and part of that comes down to where you buy it. That's why when you buy a bike at Walmart, all those things happen. You buy it from a shop, it should be thoroughly test ridden to the point where, like, cables seating in and headsets coming loose really shouldn't be an issue. Not to say that it's impossible. It's just like that's the first line of defense. And then the second line of defense is that shop saying, bring it back after 2 rides, and have us check over it, and then actually following through and checking on, like, the things you're mentioning.
You mentioned a few things already as far as, checking to see the headset's loose and spoke tension and chains. What are some other things people can check for, even if they don't have any tools like a chain checker?
Well, once the bike is worn in, I think that, knocks and noises, like, go unnoticed a lot, which is kind of amazing to me, but I remember taking my bike in and it sounding like, Bojangles, and I was totally surprised that stuff was wrong with it, but now, it's a little different. Like, things annoy me. Like, if you really want to annoy a mechanic, or especially a BMXer, put a BB in their handlebar. They won't even make it across the street. One thing I'll do when I put a bike up in a stand is I'll spin the wheel, and then I'll just touch the handlebar or the frame. And if that back hub is worn out, you're going to feel that vibration through the frame, even if it's not loose. Bearing coming loose, that's an indication of wear. But vibration is a really good indication of wear as well, and it's really easy. You don't have to take anything apart. The same approach can be taken for headsets, bottom brackets, even free hubs. Like, you just have to isolate each thing. If you're in tune with your machine, it actually goes a long way. Things tend to happen in, like, gradual degradation, of condition. Like, it's not like you're running down the trail and then something all of a sudden is loose and, rears its ugly head. That happens, but it's kind of more rare, Usually there's not like an event, especially with suspension. There's not like, you're going to notice it more after the service than before. It's just hard to feel that slow degradation of condition.
You mentioned lubing chains, and some people, might just grab some WD-40 or something or spray on there. Maybe let's be a little more specific. What would you suggest lubing for chain, and what does proper maintenance of a chain look like?
Well, there's a lot of lubes on the market, and they all do the same job. They lube your chain, obviously. Some last longer, some work better in drier conditions, some work better in wet conditions. I really think we should all be making a push to go towards biolubes. Even though they're not as long-lasting and effective, it's better than putting toxic things like PTFE and Teflon out into the water. Aside from that recommendation, Tri-Flow is used in a lot of shops, and it does a very good job at being economical. The longer lasting lubes are going to be I really like Bow Shield, Demon-Tech. Actually, I used to mix the Demon-Tech thick and thin and just run that all year. When someone brings a bike in and it's dusty and dry, and I just wipe the chain off and then lube it and wipe it off again, it's a massive improvement. It's one of the biggest improvements you can make. And then, that goes hand in hand with cleaning the cassette and cleaning the pulleys on the derailleur and the chain ring of grime. Little hook pick. And I'll just, scrape grime off the pulleys, clear all the little holes out. Getting the bike wet and actually scrubbing the cassette and the chain down with a good stiff brush. Probably a once a month thing at the least, if you're riding in dry conditions. And then if you're riding in muddy conditions, you can't get mud off your bike quick enough. You have to think of mud as like a sponge, and when it stays around bearings, it's going to pull all the moisture out of the bearings. So if you come home and your bike's all caked in mud, just get it off quick. And then, obviously relubing the chain is going to be smart because it will rust by morning if you don't throw a little bit of lube on there after stripping it off. I don't really use pressure washers. I don't really feel like there's a need. I know that Muck-Off makes one, and a lot of people have great success with that. I just use a hose and then relube and dry it.
What issues, if you leave them unchecked, will cause bigger issues down the road?
Okay, here's a good one. I used to run a hardtail with a dual crown fork on it, a Monster T, and I had a handlebar. I think it was an Azonic. And one day it started creaking, I noticed, and then it kept creaking for 6 months or 7 months or whatever. And then eventually I went to manual off a log, and the handlebar just came out of the stem. And I had just hit a bunch of jumps higher on the hill, and it was like a last little section of the mountain. I could have died, and that was just from a creak. But the handlebar had split right down the middle. Another one that happened was back when we used to use ISIS bottom brackets. Same deal. I ran a creek for a really long time. And then one day I hit a jump and both pedals went to the ground, straight down, but they were still attached into the bike. The left one was free and the right one was obviously attached to the drive, and they were independent of each other. So the spindle snapped. That kind of stuff is less prevalent because technologies have improved, testing's improved, but the principle is, or the takeaway is, if something's creaking, you should probably check it or have it checked. Pivots can really do some damage to themselves if left unchecked. Case in point, Santa Cruz rear ends. They run an expanding bolt that has to be torqued on the inside properly and then torqued on the next step out, which is, just to hold that inner tension. The suspension will loosen a little bit so that there's play, and people will go and put a wrench on that outside bolt and turn it and feel that it's tight and be like, oh well. Well, they can't really tighten it from that outside bolt. You have to take that bolt out to get the big one in the middle. And those can really, the bearings can be trashed very quickly by running them loose. Running anything loose in general is an invitation for problems. Running things unchecked, spoke tension's huge. If you're wheel is getting softer and softer and softer, like the tension is loosening on the spokes, you will fold it like a taco one day. From a performance standpoint, like dot fluid is hugely affected by moisture. And if you're not flushing those brakes out on the regular, you know, they will boil at a lower temperature. It's going to happen. So, you know, as far as like keeping the bike running in a high performance state, or running as it was designed to run, like things have to be serviced on intervals for those reasons, because like, you know, dot fluid absorbs moisture from the atmosphere. And if you just leave it in your brakes until your brakes stop working, you're not going to have very good working brakes for a long time. On that note, lubrication on the rotors and on the pads, it's a big no-no. So I would advise against the use of anything aerosol. I'm a real big fan of this stuff, Maxima SC1. It's great for just polishing the bike, making it look clean, and actually it does have a reduction of friction effect on the suspension, but that stuff I would never spray it toward a bike. I would spray it on a rag, wipe it on the bike. Chain lubes are, you know, the biggest hazard. Like, you know, you're lubing your chain and you're also lubing your disc at the same time. If you have even the slightest inclination of like, maybe I got some lube on my rotors when I did this lube up or that oil change, Windex takes it off. I would always use Windex to clean rotors. If you need to try to get oil out of pads, like usually it's a lost cause, but Windex will suck it out in some instances.
So switching gears here a little bit, let's say I'm riding my bike down the hill, I crash it. What are some things that I maybe should look at my bike after the crash before I ride off?
The first thing you got to check is the brakes, obviously, because you don't want to ride down the trail without your brakes working. So check the hoses that they're not ruptured and squirting oil all over. They're pretty tough. And then I would go and check the drivetrain, make sure the derailleur hanger hasn't bent to the point where your derailleur is in the spokes. That one happens a lot when you're like locking your bike up next to other bikes. But if a bike takes a tumble, it can certainly hit the derailleur, which is going to possibly bend the hanger. And a hanger that's bent is not going to allow a derailleur to shift properly, as many of us have experienced. In case people don't know what a hanger is, it's a little piece of tin that attaches to your frame. Now a lot of them are part of the dropout, or they are the dropout. And they're replaceable. They're an engineered weak point. So they're supposed to break before your derailleur breaks. So other than that, I would check for bent or broken spokes, spin the wheel, check the tires, because, you know, you can get a burp, a release of air from the tire if it's tubeless. Not so much anymore on newer bikes, but certainly bikes about between 7 and 4 years old, that's an issue. Pick the bike up on the back wheel and bounce it. See if you notice any knocking or anything. You know, big scratches on the handlebars are possibly a hazard. So if you take a good gouge to a handlebar, probably time to get a new one.
What are some things that somebody just getting into bike mechanics, you know, somebody's not that familiar with it, what are some things that they probably just shouldn't touch?
This shock is charged with nitrogen, and this little white thing is a pellet in there, and that fills the tool interface, so you can't go screwing with it. Not all shocks have that. You can release pressures and oils by taking off small screws and things from your shock. So if you're not well versed in suspension work, I would advise against it. Derailleurs are a tough one because everybody wants to tune their derailleur and they think it's super easy, but you know, there's some things that you have to just know what to do to get it in the right order. I think that probably the biggest one of the whole bike would be cable tension. Don't go screwing with your shifter cable tension if you don't know what it's doing. Second behind that would be limit screws. Actually, that'd probably be a first. Like limit screws on your derailleur, if you don't know what they're doing, don't turn them. because they get turned to position one time, and then they're done. That's the end of them needing attention, unless something gets bent. If you must mess around with cable tension, always do it in the highest gear. So shift the bike down to the highest cog, and then there you can loosen the bolt and adjust the cable tension without fear of losing your spot on the index points. Cable tension is always supposed to be adjusted in the highest gear with the derailleur sitting against the high limit stop. If you're adjusting your indexing in any other way, you're doing it wrong.
It's also a lot harder to do it anywhere else too, because you have way more tension on the cable.
Yeah.
So let's talk about, there's lots of guides on the internet, do-it-yourself stuff for suspension service, derailleur adjustments, all that sort of stuff. Have you seen people follow some of those guides and end up in a bad place?
Yes. So last week, I took a call from a customer with a DPS shock, a super rare shock that came on a Specialized that runs a specific size and dimension so that you can't put an aftermarket shock on it. It's only going to run what it came with. It's actually the reason why the company Bike Yoke was started, was to combat that and allow the customer to ride a common size shock. So customer gets online and sees that he can order a $20 seal kit, Fox Float seal kit, and take his air can apart and do a quick service. So he goes to the Fox website and he looks up the right service procedure, pulls the shock off his bike, unscrews the air can, and it pops in his face, even though he let all the air out. He followed the procedure. He did everything right. However, the nut that holds the compression stack, the compression assembly together on the inside, had fallen off. And so when he popped the air can apart, it, purged all the oil, because it's charged to some of those are charged to 600 PSI in the IFP port. So, he got it all over himself, wasn't wearing goggles or anything, and called me up and was definitely up a creek. And he didn't do anything wrong. He did everything right. He was trying to service it. He had the right parts, and it was just a surprise. So if you're going to touch anything with oil or pressure in it, always wear your safety glasses, because you don't want to lose an eyeball.
Yeah, I've had a couple close calls of that. One was I had a fork, as an older fork, and it was a cartridge system, and a friend of mine was a mechanic, and at one point he'd swapped the cartridge system out for his coil, and I think I'd forgotten about that. And I took it to a bike park, and the suspension was really wonky after that, so I decided to service it. I took it apart. When I took it apart, the coil came out of one side, but there was nothing in the other side. I'm like, well, what's going on here? And so I was kind of poking at it. And when I was poking at it, there was a coil that was inside that was fully compressed. It had been jammed down into place. And me tapping at it released it. And it just went right past my face. That was a close call. And I had another time too where I was servicing a damper as an open damper. And I was taking it all apart. And I released all the pressure. But for whatever reason, there was still pressure on this one. It was a dual air one, and maybe I only got one side or something. And the next thing I know, this giant gush of oil just comes spraying out of my face, because that damper took something like 100 mil of oil or something. It was like, I'm wearing it now.
That's a health hazard. Things that they shouldn't get into. Well, I would say bearings are a big one. If we take a look at this here, Specialized Enduro, there are 14 bearings in that pivot system that need to be taken out and replaced once, it's time. And there's so many tools out there to do the job right, but so many people think that they can punch the bearing out and then get a socket and drive it in, and that's that. that is going to destroy some stuff. If you don't have a very capable bearing press, don't even get into it, because if you get a bearing in there sideways, you can absolutely toast a frame or a link or, you know, some kind of housing that you're trying to push a bearing into. A lot of linkages will be hollow in the middle, and you'll have to get bearings in on the sides. And so, you know, even with the bearing press, you can destroy things. Like if you try to press bearings into a bridge from the outside and there's nothing in the middle to take the load, you know, you'll just crush that linkage plate. And, you know, that kind of thing happens all the time. Wheel work. You can probably build a wheel with the help of a YouTube guide. If your life depends on that bike working properly, like, wheels are not something you want to mess with, because they can, you know, things can snap, and wheels need to be, you know, within certain parameters to give you the right control. And it's really, really easy to tighten the spoke too tight and then like pull a hole through the rim that the spoke will never then attach to again.
Really appreciate your time, Dan. Any other thoughts you want to share with us?
Just keep in tune with your bike and keep it clean.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
See you on the trails.